A few months ago, I wanted to find out how dangerous whips are, and so I learned to use one. And even though it's really powerful, when I tried replacing the original cracker, which is a tiny nylon rope at the end of the whip, with a steel wire, the damage got definitely higher. And so I started wondering, if a whip was entirely made of stronger and heavier materials compared to a normal one, and it would still be able to travel as fast as a normal whip, could it slice through anything? Like if it was a blade? Well, I have a ballistic dummy, so now I only needed the strong whip. At first, I wanted to buy one, so I started looking for it online, and I found just a few steel whips, but they're not actually whips. What I found was a lot of videos of Asian guys cracking massive chain whips, but the problem with something like that is obviously the weight. That chain is probably impossible to lift, and that makes it the deadliest weapon in the world to use against ant colonies. I got nothing against ants though, and I wanna be able to crack my whip mid-air, because they do this like mosquitoes.
Take that.
So, I couldn't find anybody that was selling the whip I was looking for. Maybe because it's a bad idea, probably because it's dangerous for everything and everyone around me, and me. But I guess there was only one way to find out. I was gonna have to build it myself, and then compare it to the normal whip by testing both against a bunch of different targets. So, to make the whip as powerful as possible, the first step was to figure out how whips actually work. And after a while, I found a few articles and videos that explained exactly what I needed. Basically, when you swing a whip, your hand and the handle of the whip move relatively slow, but they also generate momentum, which is the loop you see there. And a few years ago, this guy basically said that the momentum at the beginning and at the end of the whip has to stay the same. But since the base of the whip is much heavier than the tip, the only way momentum can stay the same is by increasing the speed. So the loop needs to travel faster and faster as the section of the whip gets smaller, till it gets to the cracker, a tiny, light rope that travels really fast, like 900 miles per hour fast. So basically, instead of a whip, a big mass with low speed turns into a really high speed when the mass is small. For this reason, when buying all the materials, I looked for something really heavy for the base of the whip and lighter for the tip. Something more durable and more dense than a normal whip, but also flexible, so that it could still move very fast. And also safety goggles. So for the body of the whip, I went with progressively smaller wire ropes. A 6mm one, a 4mm one, and a 2mm one. And then a tiny wire rope that I was gonna use as the cracker of the whip. Somebody actually already makes self-defense weapons out of wire ropes. And they are really cute. Because now, imagine that, traveling faster than the speed of sound. But the main reason I picked wire ropes is because they are heavier than the classic materials used for a whip. And since they're flexible, I believe they could still create the loop and behave exactly as a whip does. And to make sure the whip was gonna be as powerful as possible, to increase the weight even further, I got this big chain that I actually stole from my bike. And the plan was to place it right after the handle. I knew chains could work as whips thanks to the ant killer guys. But I still wanted to double check that and see how he behaved. And I almost lost my knee while doing that. Okay, maybe I'm being too dramatic. My plan was to make the new whip about as long as the latter one. A shorter whip would probably be easier to handle, which wouldn't be too bad. Because when I spanked myself with a normal whip, I basically just stopped thinking and I felt the need to leave because of the pain. And I don't want to even think about what would happen with the steel one. But a shorter whip would also be less powerful. So yeah, so I cut the 4 ropes. 2 meters for the big one, 1.5 for the medium one, 1.2 for the small one, and then a few centimeters for the cracker. And like that, I ended up with a total length of 3 me and about 1 foot. Plus the chain and the handle that I'm gonna realize I didn't take into account later. Now the hardest part was putting them together. At first, I thought about welding them, but since the ropes are really thin, I feared they would just melt. Moreover, I went back home for Christmas, and I have no idea where my father keeps the welding machine. Luckily though, there are a bunch of ways to connect wire ropes together. It must be that somebody had my same idea of making a powerful whip, and they ended up making bridges. Anyways, my top priority for this was to find a connection that would let the ropes move freely, without interrupting the loop. My second priority was that it looked kinda good, and my third priority was that the connections were strong enough to resist the stress, avoiding to launch supersonic steel ropes into my neighbor's garden. Spoiler, I think I failed the last one. And for all those reasons, I decided to go with swag sleeves. Sorry, swage sleeves. These are commonly used for steel wires, and even though they don't look too solid to me, when installed properly, the strength of termination is 90% of the breaking strength of the cable. When installed properly. Did I already say that? There are also different kinds of connections, like these clamps, but I figured dangerous spikes and supersonic whips wouldn't go well together. And so I picked the option of the swage sleeves, and I tried to make the eye as tight as possible so that it wouldn't slow down or stop the loop of the whip. Then I connected all the cables together, and the last step was to secure the swage sleeves. To do that, you need to crimp them, using the swage tool. And like that, the body of the whip was basically ready. This was the easiest and fastest way I could find to connect all the cables together, and I was actually surprised and happy that it worked. For like 5 minutes, because in that moment, I started to have a few doubts that almost made me quit this entire idea. Basically, I randomly tried moving the rope like a whip, and I noticed the connection between the cables was making the system bend on itself. While a normal whip has some sort of rigidity, it's not completely flexible and it doesn't fold on itself. But in this case, the medium cable kept folding over the big one, and I was worried it was gonna prevent the whip from working like a whip. Yeah. So I decided to quickly test it, and with that, I realized two things. The first is that the whip wasn't behaving like a whip at all. And the second is that the whip kept spanking me. And the crazy part is that even at that low speed, it was already hurting. So I had two problems to fix. The first one was fixing the whip so that it could go supersonic, and the second one was not getting spanked by the supersonic whip. So I tried first tightening the eyes, making them so tight they basically couldn't move. But even though the whip got slightly better, that didn't really work. Then my father came home and we found the welding machine. So he tried welding the connections, but as expected, the welding machine was way too hot, and it simply melted the wires of the cables. So I spent a while thinking about new ways of making the connections, and do you remember those clamps with dangerous spikes? Well, I decided to use those. The reason why I did that is because when I tried making a connection with this kind of clamps, I realized they were making the whip much more rigid than before, solving, in theory, the spanking problem. Hopefully. Now, before testing the whip, I had the chain and the handle left. And honestly, I wasn't entirely sure if the chain was gonna exponentially increase the power, thanks to the weight, or simply slow everything down, because of the weight. Or even worse, since the whip is already really long, the extra weight and length could make it way too hard to handle, and much more dangerous. So, because of that, I decided to cut the chain in half. And then I used a climbing clamp to connect the two portions. The idea was try attaching half of the chain to the whip first, and then the entire chain, and see which one worked the best. Also, I know it doesn't look pretty, but my goal was making the most powerful whip, and not the prettiest one. And I'm sure he has a great personality. Anyways, I attached half of the chain to the whip, and I quickly wanted to test it, mainly to see if I was at least on the right path. And from this test, you can tell two things. One, I'm not really into fashion, and two, even with half chain, this was actually kinda working like a whip. And when I tried to crack it, this happened. So after quickly destroying a pomegranate and painting the house with it, I attached the second half of the chain to it, because I was confident that was gonna make it even faster. And even though I felt like my arm was about to fall off because of the weight of the whip, my technique was also slightly improving, and with the full chain, I got something similar to a crack. To be fair, it was not the classic sound of the whip, it was different. For now. The whip was picking up water from the ground and turning it into mist. I think because of how fast it was flying. And I know it looks like I'm not happy about it, but I really was. It's just that the sound this thing makes, combined with the idea of it being a steel cable traveling as fast as a 9mm bullet, not that far away from my face, well, it was unusual, to say the least. I mean, what would you think if you saw some random dude using a supersonic chain whip in his backyard? Well, I was thinking the same thing. Anyways, before actually testing the whip, and compare it to the normal one against all the targets, there was one more thing I had to improve to consider it complete. If you pay attention in the slow motion here, you see that the whip moves on the same plane till it gets to the connection of the big cable with the medium cable. And I wanted to fix that, because I believe that that movement was actually slowing the whip down. If you remember, I scrapped my first design because I was worried about the lack of rigidity of the whip. But the chain is completely flexible, and it's free to move in every direction. And still, it was perfectly working like a whip. And so I started wondering, what if my first design with the swage sleeves was actually better than the new one? My hope is that with the old connections, everything was gonna be able to move in a fluid way, exactly how it was happening with the chain. So to find out, I tried making it once again. And even with half chain, this whip was not only working, but it was actually working better than the previous design. And my only explanation for the fact that now these kind of connections are perfectly functioning, and before they weren't, is that I was the problem, meaning lack of skills on my side. Then I tried attaching an even smaller cable at the end of the tip, and for the first time, I got an actual crack out of it. The body of the whip, without the handle, weighs 4.2 kilograms, or 9.25 pounds, and that makes it 7 times heavier than the normal bullwhip. It's probably not the best looking whip out there, but with the eye connections, I felt it was looking pretty good. At this point, only the handle was missing. And also the cracker. I mean, I actually had it before, but I think I lost it right after cracking it for the first time. So I left it without the cracker. What I didn't know is that that would eventually make the whip literally sound like a gunshot. And as per the handle, I thought about building one, but all my tools are like half Europe away, and I didn't want to use stuff from my father's workshop to build one. So I decided to use a wrench. And like that, the whip was finally complete. Now I wanted to find out if the custom whip was actually more powerful than the normal one, and if it was, how much more powerful. And to do that, I got a bunch of different targets, starting from the softest, apples, then soda cans, pineapple and pumpkin, and I also got ballistic gelatin, that I already used in another video but I'm gonna use again because it's expensive. And then finally, a ballistic dummy. The plan was to test each whip against all these targets and then compare the damage. Alright, apples are first. So I'm gonna start with the classic bullwhip and then I'm gonna try the chain one. It's like a 99% chance I'm gonna hit the table. Well, it's been a while since I properly used the whip, and you can clearly see the results. But after a few tries, I finally hit the target. Apple. I was expecting the whip to cut the apple, but it actually exploded instead. To be fair, I'm not sure if I hit it with the cracker or with the body of the whip, and my camera in slow motion doesn't give me much more information. And then I wanted to try with the chain whip. The plan was to start gently, to be as accurate as possible. But at the first attempt, this happened. And when I checked the damage on the table, I got excited for the whip, and also sad for the table. I dented the table, like... Let me show you. And in that moment, I realized that this thing might actually be more powerful than I thought. I did that. And that theory was confirmed on the next attempt. Well, it cracks now. This is so scary. That was the loudest crack I've ever heard in my life. You probably can't tell the difference from the camera, but it was way louder than the normal bullwhip. It basically sounded like a gunshot, and I believe it's the handle that made the whip much more powerful than before. And as a reminder, that crack means that the steel rope was flying faster than the speed of sound. That is insane! Well, what wasn't insane was my accuracy with it. Using this whip is pretty painful because of how heavy it is, and every time I cracked it, it was kinda pulling my entire arm and body with it. Moreover, I was shooting high to avoid destroying the table, but after trying for a while, I decided to just give up with the apple, and I moved on to the next, taller and harder target. Soda can, leather whip. This time, I got a clean hit with the bullwhip, and it kinda bended the aluminum, but it didn't cut the can. So I moved to the chain one, and like before, it made me dance for a while. It is so loud. But then, after a few tries, I realized that if I wanted to crack the whip on the target, I had to aim a little to the left of it. And like that, I got it. And even though I still probably didn't hit the can with the cracker, the whip cut it in half. And I was really happy about it. The worst part is gone with these small targets. It took me a while and I lost an arm. You see the problem? Luckily now, we only got the big targets and then the ballistic gelatin. Let's do it. As usual, I tried with the bullwhip first. But this time, I actually hit the target a few times. And that's because even if I hit the pumpkin clean, I basically did no damage to it. It basically just scratches it. You see? The chain whip was a different story though. The first hit wasn't clean at all. But it made me realize that this whip would be actually perfect to grab stuff. And I've been finding it useful, especially when I sit on my sofa and I forget to grab the remote control. Before, I used to stand up. Now I'm simply using my chain whip, and it's been working flawlessly. Anyways, even with that first hit, the whip left a deep cut into the pumpkin. So then I tried again, and even though I left another big cut, I also realized something. This part of the whip is wet, but the cracker is totally dry. That means I'm hitting the pumpkin with that part. So before moving to the fancy targets, I guess I had to learn how to use the whip. This time I walked further away from the pumpkin. It doesn't really look like it from the camera, but I'm probably at 7 meters from the target. And this way I got two pretty good hits. The first one that almost broke the pumpkin in half, almost with the cracker, and then the second one, cracker. And I left a nice deep cut with it. And even if my arm was basically just a dangling useless thing at this point, after quickly testing the whip against a pineapple and splitting it in half, I was curious to see what kind of damage the whip could do to the ballistic gel and most importantly to the ballistic dummy. The ballistic gelatin should simulate the density of muscle tissue, but they usually test this against bullets, and also it doesn't have bones. Anyways, I hit it first a few times with a normal bullwhip, and it just left a few light marks on it, but basically nothing. That's when I started to believe the gelatin might actually be much harder than skin. I still wanted to see what was gonna happen with the custom whip though. So I flipped the gelatin and I also replaced the cracker of the whip with a brand new steel rope. And this time, I got a perfect hit right away. The cracker left a deeper mark than the bullwhip, but it didn't cut the gelatin. And I honestly can't believe that's accurate. There is no way that wouldn't cut. And so I decided to move right away to the ballistic dummy. This one not only has a layer of ballistic gelatin, but it should also simulate bones. Anyways, I tried hitting it with the bullwhip, and it did basically nothing to it. While for the chain whip, the first two hits kinda scratched the head of the dummy, but, at least apparently, I couldn't see any damage to it. Probably because I was looking at the wrong spot. So, for this one, I decided to change strategy. My plan was to hit the dummy 10 times, and then check the damage only after those. And honestly, I got a few clean hits. The problem is that from far away, I couldn't see any damage to the dummy. So I kept going. And even though my arm was about to fall off, I couldn't stop thinking about how fascinating this thing is. It's insane that just by using physics in a certain way, you can turn a flexible stick into a supersonic flexible stick. Anyways, after the 10th hit, I checked the actual damage. And it turns out the damage was actually much higher than what I could see. Deep cuts and broken bones basically everywhere. Cheekbone, top of the skull, right side of the skull, and a huge crack on the left side and the back of the head. And I think I kind of felt it when I did that. So, to answer the initial question, this thing is a lot more powerful than a normal bullwhip. Next, I'm gonna build an insanely powerful slingshot and a very special katana. So if you like this video, subscribe to see when they come out. Also, big thanks to my first supporters on Patreon. Everyone who supports me gets to see my videos one day before I release them on YouTube. And if you support me with $7 or more, you also get your name at the end of the video, like you see here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon with the next one.